I know how deeply you, the entire nation, and I think I may say the whole world, sympathize with me in the irreparable loss we've all suffered.
The room had been prepared for budgets, trustees, signatures, and routine royal business. Instead, King Charles opened a private letter carrying Diana's name and began reading words that instantly changed the atmosphere. Sophie listened without interrupting, her expression hardening with every sentence. Then came the passage that crossed a line she could no longer ignore. Before the board could even react, she pushed back her chair, stood, and walked straight out of the meeting. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles had entered the gathering expecting control. The Royal Trust Board, a formal body responsible for overseeing charitable decisions and royal funds, had been called to discuss future responsibilities. Sophie sat among the trustees because her role had made her one of the family's trusted hands. William was not beside her, but his connection to Diana's legacy meant every word touching his mother carried institutional danger. The king knew the document was different. Diana's private letter had remained sealed for years, preserved as guidance on how charitable work tied to her name should be protected from rivalry, image management, and family politics. Charles had received permission to review it. Nothing required him to read it aloud. That choice belonged to him alone, and Sophie understood the distinction immediately. Sophie stayed perfectly still as he continued. Then Charles reached the passage warning that Diana's charitable legacy should never be absorbed into another royal figure's personal influence or turned into proof of loyalty during family disputes. The trusted confidant removed her glasses, closed the folder before her, and fixed her eyes on him. Charles paused. He saw the anger. He continued anyway. The silence became brutal. Sophie pushed her chair back, and the scrape cut across the room harder than any raised voice. Charles lowered the letter and quietly said her name. She kept walking. Before reaching the door, she turned just enough to deliver one sentence. "You know why she wrote that." Then she left. Charles did not answer. The trustees now understood that Diana's warning referred to something older, sharper, and far more personal than general charity policy. Worse, Sophie believed the king was using private moral guidance, in exactly the way Diana had feared, as leverage inside a royal power struggle. The monarch ordered a brief recess, but the meeting had already broken apart. Sophie moved down the corridor toward a private room where William was waiting for word. Her walkout had shocked the board. What she was about to tell the future king would explain why she could no longer remain seated. Sophie had spent years becoming one of the monarchy's safest pairs of hands. Charles knew it. William knew it. The late queen had known it too. She was not someone who stormed from meetings for effect, which made her decision far more serious. For Sophie to abandon the king in front of trustees, something inside that room had struck at a principle she considered non-negotiable, and Diana's letter had exposed exactly where that line was drawn. Sophie carried influence because she had earned trust without demanding attention. She had spent years supporting charities, calming family tensions, and avoiding the public feuds that could damage the crown. The line of succession, the formal order deciding who inherits the throne, did not place her near the center of royal power, yet her judgment still mattered deeply. Charles respected that restraint. He knew she rarely challenged him, which made her departure impossible to dismiss as emotion. Charles saw the Royal Trust Board differently. To him, the body responsible for overseeing major charitable interests could bring stability to causes connected with different generations of the family. Diana's letter appeared to offer guidance strong enough to end arguments that had lingered for years. The king believed her words could settle the matter. Sophie believed using them that way risked turning a private warning into evidence for a political victory. Sophie entered the side room and found William studying briefing papers. He looked up, saw her expression, and immediately stood. She did not waste time. He read it. William froze. He did not ask what she meant. His silence told her everything. He already knew the letter existed. William's anger rose quickly, but the prince controlled his voice. Sophie asked whether he had encouraged Charles to bring Diana's words before the board. He answered firmly that he had not. That denial mattered. For the first time, father and son stood on different sides of how her private legacy should be handled. Sophie then explained what disturbed her most. Diana had not merely wanted charities protected. She had warned that decisions involving her name must never be used to punish one royal, elevate another, or force loyalty inside the family. Several new trust proposals could now be judged against that principle. Worse, the trusted confidant admitted she had warned Charles the previous night in a private conversation not to read the letter aloud. His answer had been chillingly simple: "We have avoided clarity long enough." Charles, meanwhile, dismissed the trustees and remained behind. He crossed the room, stopped beside Sophie's empty chair, and placed Diana's letter where she had been sitting. The king stared at it without speaking, finally feeling the cost of the choice he had defended minutes earlier. William then asked Sophie what she meant by telling Charles, "You know why she wrote that." Her answer changed everything. The letter, she said, began with one specific charity meeting years earlier, a confrontation the family had buried ever since. To understand why Sophie could not remain in that boardroom, the story has to return to the night Diana first decided that her legacy needed protecting from the palace itself. The letter did not emerge from vague unhappiness. It was born from one specific confrontation. Years earlier, Diana had walked into a private charity strategy meeting, expecting a discussion about vulnerable families and humanitarian work. What she encountered instead was a debate over ownership, royal visibility, and whose name would carry the institution forward. One conversation left her convinced that even compassion could become currency inside the monarchy. That night, she began writing the warning Charles had just read aloud. Diana had already become uneasy about the way charitable work could be pulled into royal competition. A patronage of formal royal association with a charity or cause could bring attention, influence, and status, but she wanted some causes kept beyond family rivalry. For her, the people receiving help had to remain more important than the name attached to the work. Charles understood that concern, but he did not always share her fear of institutional control. Years later, Sophie encountered the sealed document while helping review historical charity records. She was not given the full contents, but a documented archive note explained that Diana had left instructions intended to protect certain charitable interests from future family conflict. The trusted confidant remembered that warning because it sounded unusually specific. She never imagined she would one day hear Charles read from the same letter before a board. Diana's breaking point had come during a private Kensington Palace charity meeting. A senior advisor proposed folding one of her independent humanitarian initiatives into a larger palace-controlled trust once her future royal role changed. Charles was present. He listened. He did not immediately reject the idea. Diana closed her notebook, turned toward him and said, "Then this was never about the people we said it was about." Charles followed her after the meeting and tried to calm the situation. He insisted the proposal was administrative, designed to protect continuity rather than erase her influence. Diana refused to accept that distinction. She told him that once charity became a tool for controlling reputations, the institution had already forgotten the people it claimed to serve. The king never forgot that exchange, because he had been there when her trust finally cracked. Sophie now explained the parallel to William in their private conversation. The current board agenda contained a restructuring plan disturbingly similar to the proposal Diana had rejected years earlier. William immediately understood why she had walked out. If Charles used the letter to justify another consolidation of power, then Diana's warning was being turned into the very weapon she had tried to prevent. Diana had drafted the first version of the letter that same evening, and later sealed the final copy with instructions that it should only be used when the independence of her charitable legacy was genuinely threatened. Charles knew exactly why it existed. William's concern shifted instantly. He no longer asked whether his father had the right to read it. He wanted to know why Charles had chosen this meeting, this proposal, and this moment. Sophie answered quietly. The reason was still sitting on the board table. The past had now collided with the present, and when Sophie returned to face Charles, the argument would no longer be about a dead woman's letter. It would be about what the king intended to do next. When Sophie returned, the trustees had not yet been called back. Charles was standing beside the windows, with Diana's letter folded in his hand. This time there were no board members, no secretaries, and no carefully prepared agenda between them. Sophie entered, closed the door herself, and told the king exactly why she had walked out. Charles defended his decision. She did not soften hers, and within minutes, years of restraint shattered. Sophie went straight to the point. The restructuring proposal would combine several charitable funds under one royal trust structure. meaning a single system would control appointments, public identity, and how money was distributed. Charles believed that kind of central control would prevent rival projects from pulling the family in different directions. She was not against reform itself. What she could not accept was the timing. Diana's private words had been brought into the room just as trustees were being asked to surrender part of their independence. Sophie looked directly at him. "You used her words to win the room." Charles denied it at once. He said the letter had been relevant to the discussion and that ignoring it would have been dishonest. She stepped closer and answered that if he truly wanted Diana's wishes respected, he should have circulated the complete document privately. Instead, he had chosen the passages that supported his argument and read them aloud when every trustee was listening. Charles finally lost his restraint. The king told her he had spent decades watching Diana's memory used against him, often by people who had no idea what happened inside their marriage. He refused to accept that he was now forbidden from acknowledging her wishes, simply because the words were uncomfortable. Sophie was stunned by the bitterness still alive beneath his control. Then she answered quietly that this was exactly why he should never have been the person deciding which parts of the letter the board heard. Charles said nothing for a moment. Then he held the paper out. "Read the last paragraph." Sophie took it. Her anger changed almost immediately. The final instruction stated that if control over Diana-linked charitable work ever became disputed, priority should be given to her direct heirs, and independent trustees, rather than whoever temporarily held wider royal authority. She read the passage again, then looked up. "Has William seen this?" Charles admitted he had not. Sophie's shock hardened into something colder. The king had stopped reading before the one paragraph that limited his own influence. He insisted he had intended to raise it later, after the board understood the broader context. She did not believe that explanation was enough. To her, the omission had shaped the entire room before anyone knew the full truth. Sophie handed the letter back, but did not step away. She told Charles the meeting could not continue until William had read every word and decided whether he intended to use the authority Diana had explicitly preserved for her sons. Charles had opened the meeting believing Diana's words would strengthen his hand. Instead, the unread final paragraph had placed the future king directly between him and the decision. Royal power is rarely as simple as a crown, a signature, or a chair at the head of a table. Diana's final paragraph had created something far more dangerous, a moral veto. Charles could command the meeting, but he could not easily command the meaning of her words. And now William was reading the complete letter in silence, while Sophie watched him process a message from his mother that could overturn the king's entire plan. William understood the difference between legal power and moral authority. Charles still chaired the trust and could influence its direction, but independent trustees and governance rules, the formal procedures that control how the board makes decisions, prevented the monarch from simply ordering every outcome. Diana's letter carried no constitutional force, yet because her name stood at the center of the dispute, those words could change how every trustee judged the proposal. William asked Sophie for several minutes alone. The prince remained at the end of the table after the room cleared, reading the final paragraph once, then again. He did not react with anger. His first response was grief. The letter was no longer an argument to him. It was his mother, speaking into a family conflict she had somehow feared long before this meeting ever began. Sophie returned quietly. William told her he would not use Diana's words to humiliate Charles. The future king could have turned the final paragraph into a direct challenge against his father, but he refused. Sophie felt immediate relief because that was the principle she had been defending from the beginning. If Diana's letter became a weapon in William's hands instead, nothing had really been protected. Charles entered moments later. The king looked from Sophie to his son and asked the question directly. Did William intend to challenge the restructuring? William chose his words carefully. He said he intended to challenge how Diana's letter had been introduced, not use her memory to defeat his father. Charles heard the distinction, and for the first time the dispute shifted away from personalities and toward procedure. William then proposed a suspension. The plan would be paused while independent trustees board members, without immediate family roles, reviewed the restructuring and the complete letter together. No selective quotation, no private advantage. No one, including the prince, would control what Diana's words meant. Sophie knew what came next. Board rules required a senior family trustee to second the motion before it could proceed. That responsibility fell to her. Charles understood it too. Her walkout had not removed her influence. It had made her vote more powerful than before. The trustees were called back. William formally placed the suspension before them. Silence settled over the table as every face turned toward Sophie. Walking out had been an act of conscience. Raising her hand against Charles's proposal would turn that conscience into an irreversible decision. The trustees returned expecting an awkward continuation. Instead, they found a different balance of power. Diana's letter was no longer in Charles's hand. It lay sealed beside William. Sophie had returned to her seat, but the warmth was gone from her expression. When the motion to suspend the restructuring was placed before the board, the king did not look at the trustees. He looked only at her. Then Sophie raised her hand. William spoke first. The prince formally requested that the restructuring proposal be paused until an independent review could determine whether it respected the trust's founding purpose and Diana's complete guidance. One independent review and examination carried out by trustees without immediate family influence would prevent either side from controlling the outcome. Charles listened without interruption. He understood exactly what was happening. His son was not attacking him personally. He was forcing the system to judge the decision instead. Sophie knew her part mattered even more. As the senior family trustee required to validate the procedural challenge, her support would transform William's objection from a private family disagreement into an official board action. The chair asked whether anyone would second the motion. Silence stretched across the table. Sophie looked toward Charles. Then she looked at William. "I second it." Nothing more. Charles closed his eyes for a brief moment before announcing that the motion would proceed. The king did not strike the table, challenge the rules, or demand loyalty. That restraint made the moment heavier. Two people he trusted to protect royal unity had now formally opposed his plan. His earlier anger faded into something more painful: humiliation. Sophie felt no victory. She kept her hands tightly clasped beneath the table, knowing she had placed herself directly against the reigning monarch. She had defended Diana's intent, but the cost was now real. Charles avoided her eyes. She noticed. He noticed her silence too. The trustees voted. Enough supported William's motion to halt the restructuring. The proposal was removed from the active agenda, and Diana's complete letter was transferred into confidential review. That meant the document would no longer remain under Charles's personal control during the process. For the first time since he opened it, the king had lost the power to decide how those words would be used. Charles then did something Sophie had not expected. Before the meeting ended, he asked that the review examine his own conduct as well. He wanted the trustees to determine whether reading selected portions of Diana's letter had breached governance expectations. Sophie looked up sharply. William did too. The king had invited judgment upon himself. Charles left without speaking to Sophie. Later that evening, she received a handwritten request from him, asking for a private meeting the following morning. No advisors, no trustees. No William. The institutional battle had ended in defeat for Charles, but his private request suggested the king was finally prepared to confront the part of the crisis no board could resolve. There was no long table this time, no trustees, no folders stacked between them. Charles had asked Sophie to meet him alone because the argument had reached a place where procedure was useless. She entered expecting another defense of the decision. Instead, the king had Diana's letter sealed inside an archival envelope and placed away from his chair. He did not reach for it. He simply told Sophie that when she walked out, he finally understood how deeply the reading had wounded people he trusted. Sophie remained guarded. The restructuring had been paused, and the independent review, a formal examination carried out without direct family control, was already underway. That meant Charles no longer needed to persuade her for political reasons. This meeting was about something harder: trust. She had not changed her mind about leaving the boardroom, and she had not changed her mind about the vote that followed. Charles spoke first. The king admitted that he had read Diana's letter because he wanted to prove he was no longer afraid of her memory. For years, he said, her name had carried accusation, grief, and unfinished judgment. He believed reading her concerns openly would show that he could finally face them. Instead, he now understood that he had been trying to prove something to the trustees, to William, and perhaps most of all to himself. Sophie did not comfort him. She told Charles that making peace with Diana could never mean taking ownership of her voice. He listened without interruption. The trusted confidant's anger had softened, but she refused to pretend that regret erased what had happened. Some mistakes, she said, only become meaningful when the person responsible accepts the boundary they crossed. Charles then asked the question that had troubled him since the vote. Why had Sophie returned after walking out? Sophie answered without hesitation. Leaving had been her refusal to sit through the misuse of Diana's words. Returning had been something entirely different. She had come back because refusing Charles did not mean abandoning him when the consequences arrived. The king absorbed that distinction quietly. For the first time, he understood that her defiance had not been disloyalty. It had come from loyalty with limits. Charles then disclosed, during that private conversation, the decision he had made before she arrived. He had instructed the archive custodian, the official responsible for protecting sensitive historical records, to remove Diana's original letter from all active royal files. Future access would require independent approval, including agreement from her sons or their representatives. Sophie accepted the decision, but not as absolution. She told him restraint was the first choice he had made since the crisis began, that truly honored Diana's warning. Charles thanked her quietly as she prepared to leave. Then the private peace was interrupted. A palace communications official informed the king that details of Sophie's walkout had reached the press. Charles and Sophie had found the beginning of peace behind closed doors. But outside the palace, one image would soon define the entire drama for millions. By morning, the private argument belonged to everyone. The story was no longer simply that Diana had left behind a secret letter. It was that Sophie, of the monarchy's most dependable figures, had walked out while the king was reading it. That distinction transformed the public reaction. People were not merely debating what Diana wrote. They were asking what could possibly have been said inside that boardroom to make one of Charles's quietest allies leave him sitting there. Charles understood the danger immediately. Buckingham Palace confirmed that the Royal Trust Board proposal had been suspended for independent review, meaning the disputed plan would be examined outside direct family control before any further action. The palace refused to release Diana's letter. That decision mattered because the king could have defended himself by publishing the words and arguing his case in public. Instead, he chose silence. Sophie saw the headlines over breakfast. One newspaper called her the royal who had walked out on the king. She folded the page sharply and told Edward that the story had been misunderstood. She had not abandoned Charles. She had refused to sit quietly while Diana's private words were used to shape a decision they were never meant to control. Edward listened carefully, and she repeated that distinction because, to her, it was the entire point. Charles faced a different kind of pain. An aide showed him the morning coverage, including a photograph taken after the meeting that captured how heavily the confrontation had landed on him. The king could have ordered a forceful rebuttal. Instead, he told palace communications staff that Sophie was not to be criticized, directly or indirectly. He would not turn their private disagreement into another public battle. The headlines kept growing. One major national newspaper ran the words, "Sophie walks out as Diana letter rocks royal trust," across its front page. The story spread quickly because it combined two powerful ideas: Diana's guarded legacy and a rare act of open defiance from someone known for loyalty. Sophie became a symbol of restraint, breaking under pressure. Charles became the monarch forced to answer for a decision he had already begun to regret. Crowds gathered near Buckingham Palace. Several visitors left flowers linked with memories of Diana, while one handwritten card carried a simple message: her work was never theirs to use. That sentence captured the public mood more sharply than any palace briefing. Charles responded with only one authorized statement: private words entrusted to the royal family would remain private, while the review continued. He refused to reveal the contents. Days later, Sophie and William were summoned back to hear the independent findings. Charles was already waiting. This time, Diana's letter was not in his hand. The public had already delivered its emotional judgment, but the final verdict would come from the decision that determined whether Charles had truly understood why Sophie walked away. When the board met again, the chair in front of Sophie was exactly where it had been before she walked out, but everything surrounding it had changed. The restructuring proposal was gone. Diana's original letter was no longer circulating among royal offices. Charles entered without a copy in his hand, and without any attempt to defend the decision that had started the crisis. What followed was not another royal showdown. It was something rarer, a ruling, an apology, and a boundary finally accepted. Charles listened as the independent findings were formally delivered. The review and examination conducted without direct family control concluded that the restructuring plan should not continue in its original form because it placed too much authority over separate charitable identities under one system. The report also found that while the king had been permitted to consult historical documents, reading selected parts of Diana's letter before the trustees had created an unfair impression because the full context had not been presented. Charles stood before anyone else could respond. The king did not blame advisors, procedure, or pressure. He told the board that the decision had been his alone and that the finding was fair. Then he turned toward Sophie. He admitted that she had warned him the night before and said plainly that he should have listened. Sophie did not celebrate the apology. She simply nodded and told him that the important question was, what happened to Diana's words now? The answer came quickly. The board unanimously agreed that the original letter would return to protected archival custody, meaning it would be preserved under strict access rules rather than used in active royal business. It could not be quoted during future trust disputes, released for public relations, or used to justify family decisions without independent approval. William supported the ruling completely. The prince knew the final paragraph had given Diana's sons powerful moral standing, but he refused to turn that advantage into personal control. Protecting his mother's wishes, he said during the recorded board discussion, meant refusing to exploit them even when they benefited him. Sophie understood immediately. That was the principle she had been fighting for from the moment she stood up. Charles later acknowledged privately to Sophie that her walkout had prevented the letter from becoming a permanent weapon inside royal politics. She returned to her duties without demanding praise, while the king emerged more cautious and William more determined to separate inheritance from retaliation. Charles had entered the first meeting believing Diana's words could settle an old argument. Instead, Sophie's refusal taught him that some memories are honored by restraint, not possession. The restructuring was withdrawn. The letter was sealed. The family remained intact. The chair Sophie once abandoned was occupied again, but Diana's words stayed protected. Charles accepted the limits of his authority, and loyalty survived because one person had been willing to walk away when remaining silent would have meant surrendering what she believed was right. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.